This time on Nature, we make our first visit to Ireland, a land of myth and legend, where wild creatures have always played an important role. Hi, I'm George Page. Ireland has an ancient human history. It's seen all the ages of man, from stone to iron to bronze. But the flooded callows along the Shannon still teem with bird and insect life. The fields of Erin still flower with a richness they had tens of centuries ago. Salmon still leap up rivers that led the first men to Ireland's interior. Badgers, hares, and red deer still roam the ruins of ancient castle keeps. Ireland, through the eyes of its leading wildlife cameraman, Eamon de Boutelier. Imagine you're in Ireland, 7,000 years before Christ. Stone Age adventurers are crossing the Irish Sea in search of a new land. A 1,000 years earlier, they could have walked here. Now, rising sea levels have separated Ireland from the mainland, and they must come by boat. Frail craft of animal skin stretched over a wooden frame, perhaps little different from the curraghs still used today in the west of Ireland. In Ireland, the past is always with you. It lives in the ways of the people, in their imprint on the land. It lives in their legends and beliefs, and in their language. Over the years, the country has borne many names: Era, Bunba, Fola, and to poets, Kathleen Ní Houlihan, Roisin Duff, and Erin. In the last ice age, the face of Ireland was wiped clean. The glaciers retreated. Huge lakes flooded the center of the country. At first, the surrounding hills were bare. Forest returned some 10,000 years ago as the climate warmed up. Birch, hazel, and pine, then alder, elm, and oak. Today, most of the trees are gone, but fragments of the great Stone Age forest still survive. The ancient oak woods of Killarney and the wooded islets of the Gira on the River Lee. It was into a wilderness such as this that the first people came to the Emerald Isle. In the beginning, they lived along the coast, hunting, fishing, and gathering nuts and seeds. Then they ventured into the interior, using the rivers as highways that are still used by other travelers today. Salmon were running the rivers of Ireland long before the first human colonizers arrived, and they've taken their place in the landscape of Irish myth and legend. It's said that St. Patrick, the patron saint of Ireland, was walking one day by a river. He was hungry and asked a fisherman to give him food. The fisherman refused. But a salmon swimming up the river overheard the conversation. It thrust itself out of the water into the hungry saint's hands and offered itself up as food. As a reward for its generosity, St. Patrick blessed all salmon with the power to leap. The plentiful runs of salmon enriched the diet of the Stone Age people. And there were also trout and eel from the lakes and rivers, bass and flounder from the estuaries and the sea. Thick forests once covered what today are bare hillsides. From these woods, hunters would have taken wild boar and perhaps larger game. Red deer, the only kind native to Ireland. Like the salmon, deer too have their place in Celtic folklore. Their attributes were credited to the legendary armies of the Fianna. And Sawa, wife of Finn MacCool, was turned into a deer by a dark druid because she spurned his advances. The first people lacked the tools to clear the forest, so they camped along the shores of the lakes. Here they were well situated to fish and snare waterfowl. Few traces of those early settlements remain. They were gradually swallowed up as a major change took place, transforming the Irish landscape. Vegetation, like these reeds, decays slowly in this soggy environment, forming peat. Over centuries, the peat spread, creating a drier, nutrient-poor environment. Eventually, the reeds died out. Sphagnum moss and other plants that could tolerate these poor conditions took over, resulting in huge bogs. These bogs are so low in nutrients that some plants, like the sundew, supplement their diet by eating insects. The sphagnum grows up from the water and forms hummocks. When the hummocks reach a certain size, their tops dry out, and they're colonized by sedges, lichen, and heather. The gaps between the hummocks become new pools, and the whole process is repeated. Eventually, the bog can rise 20 or 30 feet above the original lake level. These raised bogs smothered much of Central Ireland and buried all trace of the first settlers. But the next arrivals were a different matter. 5,500 years ago, a new people reached Ireland, bringing with them a revolutionary way of life. They were the first farmers. The most impressive monuments left by these people are their graves. This is the great passage tomb at Newgrange in the valley of the Boyne. At dawn on the winter solstice, the rays of the rising sun shine straight down the tunnel to the very center of the mound. Some of these tombs are huge. Newgrange would have dominated the landscape for miles around. Others are but a shadow of their former selves. Centuries of erosion have stripped away the turf and stones, leaving just the bare bones of the largest rocks. And some were never more than the resting place of simple farmers. Agriculture really began to stamp its mark on the landscape about 4,000 years ago with the arrival of metal tools, first of copper and bronze, and much later of iron. From the Iron Age to well into this millennium, circular fortifications like this cashel or castle in County Clare sheltered the farmsteads of rural Ireland. Many of these early farmers settled here on the limestone uplands of the Burren, which means place of rock. It may look bleak and inhospitable, but the appearance is deceptive. This stony plateau lies close to Ireland's Atlantic shore and the warming influence of the Gulf Stream. Even today, the Burren is renowned for its winter grazing. What soil there is fertile, and the climate is warm enough for grass to grow right through the winter months. In the Ice Age, this land was flattened by the glaciers. As the climate warmed, the melting ice left a legacy of boulders perched incongruously on the ice-worn slabs. After the glaciers retreated, 13,000 years of rain etched an ever-deepening network of fissures in the limestone, dissolving away the living rock to percolate into subterranean caverns below. In a few places, the water comes to the surface again, but in a manner almost unknown outside the limestone regions of Ireland. This is a turlough, a temporary lake that's fed not by streams, but by water welling up through openings in its bed. The level rises and falls with the fluctuations in the underground water table. In this turlough, the water level can change as much as 40 feet. A few days earlier, this wall was several feet below the water. It's covered with a dense growth of waterweed. Any plants that grow here have to tolerate varying and often unpredictable periods of flooding and drying. Some of the plants are unique to Ireland. This one, the pallid violet, grows only in Irish turlochs. Sometimes in summer, the banks of the hollow are lined with what look like sheets of parchment laid over the grass. They can appear suddenly, almost overnight. They're the matted remains of microscopic thread-like algae that have been stranded by a fall in the water level. In the Burren, cattle are brought down from the hills in summer, the reverse of the practice in most places. At this time of year, the limestone uplands are dry and thirsty. It's only at the foot of the hills that water can be found. And the bed of the shrinking turloch offers excellent grazing. The first cattle brought to Ireland were large animals reared for their meat. Milk cows came later, at the end of the Bronze Age. In ancient Ireland, cattle were so valued that they were used as currency. On the shores of Galway Bay, the rocks of the Burren step down to the sea. At the edge of the Atlantic, a stoat is hunting. Small birds and mammals are the stoat's usual prey, but here they take fish from the rock pools. Stoats were among the few mammals that reached Ireland before it was cut off by the rising sea. Their smaller cousin, the weasel, never made it. Snakes didn't either, though St. Patrick is said to have driven them out of Ireland. Celtic folklore is rich in tales of stoats. To some, they were witches in animal form. It was also thought they could spit poison. There's a story of a mother stoat poisoning a farmer's jug of milk in revenge for disturbing her young. And children were warned by their parents to avoid being spat on by a stoat, or they would never grow. Like so many objects of fear, the stoat was given complimentary names. In Connemara, it's called on Vanine Ussel, the noble little lady. This lady and her mate have other things on their minds. To see stoats coupling is rare. On the shores nearby, choughs forage for food. These birds prefer the rocky terrain of the mountains and the coast. Choughs are related to crows, one of the most intelligent of all bird families. In Ireland, choughs are found on the steep cliffs along the Atlantic seaboard. Just as the choughs seek security on the cliffs, so too did human settlers. This is the great Iron Age fort of Duff Cahair, the Black Fort, on Inishmore, an island off the west coast of Ireland. There's just a scattering of forts like this on Ireland's western cliffs. Their origins are mysterious. They may have been built by native people during the Iron Age, or by new colonists, perhaps from the Iberian Peninsula, seeking a foothold on Ireland's Atlantic shores. Fewer doubts surround the origins of ring forts, the farmsteads of Iron Age and early Christian Ireland. These circular enclosures of earth or stone sheltered a simple cluster of wooden huts, a safe haven for families and their livestock. For 15 centuries, these were the focal points of the Irish landscape. Most ring forts were the homes of ordinary people, but a few have grander associations. Baal Baru near Killaloe was a seat of the 11th century king Breen Baru. Tradition claims it was part of a barrier he was building across the Shannon to flood the homes of his enemies. Long after their true function has been forgotten, strange beliefs still surround these ancient ring forts, affording a different kind of protection for their new occupants. An aura of superstition still clings to the eroded remnants of the banks and ditches. The trees grow undisturbed, a haven for the wild. Here, shy and secretive badgers are unafraid to come out in broad daylight because few people come here. Ancient beliefs still linger, even in the Ireland of today. Ring forts are fairy rings, the home of the good people, where the music of the fairy piper might still be heard on a summer's night. Everything growing or living here has always been considered sacred or magical in some way. The elder was an evil tree because it said the cross of Christ was made from elder. To fall asleep under an elder could be fatal, or at the very least result in madness. And an animal struck with an elder stick would grow no more. A lone whitethorn tree was said to be protected by fairies, and anyone who cut it would suffer misfortune. Superstitions like this persist even today, a mingling of ancient beliefs and Christianity. That was the next great change in Irish history, the coming of Christianity in the 5th century. This cross watches over what must have been one of the most remote and austere Christian communities of all time, the monastery of Skellig Vihil, a tiny island off the Kerry coast. As darkness falls, strange sounds echo through the deserted monastic cells. Not ghosts of long-dead monks, but birds, shearwaters, and storm petrels. The cells have new tenants now. Petrels nest between the stones of the ancient walls. It's said the monastery on Skellig Vihil was founded by St. Finian. It dates from the 6th century, and it was occupied at least until the 10th. The beehive huts that housed the small community of monks still stand. Their walls are up to 2 yards thick. The Skellig Rocks are 8 miles from the Kerry coast, and there's no easy landing. In winter, the monks were cut off for weeks at a time. And as if that wasn't remote enough, they built a hermitage 700 feet above the waves on the very highest point of the island. There they could retreat for solitary contemplation, with only the cries of the gulls and the singing of the seals for company. The evocative call of seals found an answer in the Celtic imagination. In folklore, seals were half human, the souls of drowned people. To kill a seal would bring bad luck. It might once have been a person. A seal could change into human shape. It might return to land as a woman, marry and rear a family. But she would never be happy on land, and sooner or later, the sea would claim her again. The sea people can never be content, for it is given to them that their sea longings shall be land longings, and their land longings shall be sea longings. The monks also would have shared the island with seabirds of many kinds, puffins, and kittiwakes. The cliffs of Skellig Vihil still ring with their calls today, but the most impressive seabird colonies are on the island of Little Skellig, a few hundred yards across the waves from Skellig Vihil. That white coating on the rocks isn't snow, it's birds. 20,000 gannets, one of the largest colonies in Europe. Like the monks before them, the gannets come here for peace and security. But for the monks, the security was an illusion. Despite its remoteness, the monastery was sacked repeatedly by Viking marauders. The Vikings reached the Irish coast in the 8th century, but they left little permanent mark on the landscape. Their successors were a different matter. In 1170, the Normans landed in County Wexford. They brought with them a new way of life and introduced new animals for sport and food, like fallow deer. Over the centuries, there were many more introductions to the Irish countryside. New trees were planted: beech, sycamore, and horse chestnut. These majestic additions still enhance the Irish countryside. The Norman invaders took over all the more fertile parts of the country. Ruins of their houses and holy places still dominate the Irish landscape, but some are now home to wilder creatures. With the Normans came a more organized pattern of agriculture. Among the first to practice it were the monks of the Cistercian Abbey of Corcombe Row, on the edge of the Burren. Like the Bronze Age farmers 3,000 years before, they were drawn here by the year-round grazing on the limestone hills. Indeed, the abbey's name was Sancta Maria de Petra Fertilis, St. Mary of the Fertile Rock. The harebells of the Burren find an echo in the carved columns of Corcombe Row. The flowers are unchanged, but the abbey now lies open to the sky. The monks are long gone. Others live here now. In a niche in the wall where once a roof beam might have rested, a kestrel has her nest. And in perilous proximity, a wood mouse rears her young among the fallen stones below. The young are born blind and helpless, but these are at least 2 weeks old. Unaware of the easy catch so nearby, this kestrel parent must continue hunting for its hungry brood. The land around the ruins harbors other mice, unprotected in the open country. Not far from the abbey, another old building has a new tenant. In the roof of a deserted cottage, a pine marten has her young. The Irish name for pine marten is catcreen, meaning tree cat. The cats of ancient Irish poetry and place names were almost certainly pine martens. European wildcats never reached Ireland. Pine martens will eat more or less anything: fruit, nuts, beetles, worms, frogs, carrion, and small birds. Over the years, people have made new homes for some unlikely creatures. This otter is fishing in a lordly lily pond, taking advantage of its captive prey on the estate of the Earl of Meath. Squirrels also enjoy the early morning quiet before the estate comes to life. Red squirrels once had Ireland all to themselves, but the gray squirrel is proliferating in Britain and may soon replace these residents of the Earl's estate. By the early 19th century, few trees were left in Ireland, and many of these were on the great estates. The population had risen to 8 million. So great was the demand for timber and firewood that outside the walls almost all the trees were cut. The people turned to the peat bogs, burning this precious natural resource for fuel. Then came the potato famine. Almost 1 million people died, and twice that number fled abroad. The population has never recovered. Today, it's only 4 million. The fall in population temporarily stemmed the cutting of turf for fuel, but today the assault on the bogs continues with renewed vigor. Hand cutting of turf merely nibbled at the edges of the great raised bogs of Central Ireland. Now the peat is stripped by machine and burned to generate electricity. It's taken nature centuries to build these bogs, many of which have now become brown deserts. But Ireland still has its bogs. In a few, new species have been introduced, like this American pitcher plant. Insects are attracted to the sugary secretions around the rim, but once they've ventured below this point, the plant becomes a death trap. Eventually, the insect falls into the fluid and drowns. Then it's slowly digested. Though the pitcher plant is not native to these bogs, it's quickly found a home in Ireland. Native wildflowers flourish in the Shannon Callows. Here, the land is managed in traditional ways and still blooms with the richness of the Emerald Isle. These seasonally flooded grasslands receive little artificial fertilizer. They're cut for hay late in the summer. So in the shadow of the 7 ruined churches of Clonmacnoise, the wildflowers have time to set seed. And one of Ireland's strangest birds has time to rear its young. The corncrake, more often heard than seen. Because it turns its head from side to side when it's calling and moves around between calls, its sound is very hard to locate. People credited the corncrake with powers of ventriloquism. Some even thought it called lying on its back with its feet in the air, holding up the sky for good measure. Corncrakes disappear in autumn. People believe that this strange bird hibernated, but it simply migrates in winter to warmer climates in Africa. In the cold Irish winter, the Shannon River bursts its banks and floods the meadows. For a few months each year, they become a watery wilderness. These shallow lakes and lagoons attract a great variety of wildfowl: ducks and waders from northern Europe, swans from Siberia, white-fronted geese from Greenland. "70 miles to the west of the Shannon, there's another wilderness, Connemara. Here, the balance between man and nature is still tipped in nature's favor. Human settlement is almost entirely confined to a narrow strip between the mountains and the sea. It's a hard land. Grazing is so scarce that every possible patch of grass has to be exploited. Cattle are driven across the sea to graze on offshore islands. They swim as much as half a mile. The first time they make the journey, they have to be forced. After that, they go willingly. They learn to associate the swim with the better grazing on the other side. The traditional canvas karak is still made and used here, alongside the heavier wooden karak, more suited to rocky shores. In Gaelic, karak means unsteady, but in the right hands, that makes the craft highly maneuverable. It's the ideal boat for driving cattle. Neither land nor sea alone can yield a living. Land, sea, and shore are all exploited in due season. The traditional way of life still has a strong hold here, but it's not an easy life. Seaweed is still harvested on the Connemara shores. Most of Connemara is bog or barren rock. There's little good soil. The small plots of cultivated ground owe their fertility to generations of enrichment with seaweed, which was spread on the land to create humus. Just as each household has the traditional right to cut turf or peat from a strip of bog, so too they have rights to gather seaweed from a particular section of the shore. Such rights are still jealously guarded today. Near an abandoned island cottage where these men lived as children, a heron has her nest. In Connemara, there are few trees, and herons often nest in very low bushes on lake islands. Many country people call herons cranes, but there are no true cranes in Ireland. A climene, a raft of seaweed, is being brought to shore. But today it doesn't all go on the land. Most of it is taken to a factory and put into cattle feed or used in cosmetics. Ireland is one of the last strongholds of the European otter. Otters would have been a familiar sight to the people who have wrested a living from these shores over the centuries. Like so many of Erin's creatures, they too have taken their place in local beliefs. An otter with 8 black points, nose, tail, 2 ears, and 4 feet, was called a king otter. A king otter skin carried in a boat was said to protect against ill fortune. The scallop fishermen of Clew Bay may no longer carry otter skins in their boats, but otters still watch them from the shore. Indeed, it said the otters sometimes follow boats to catch the fish disturbed by the dredges. People and animals hunt side by side, much as they might have done when those first colonists reached Ireland's shores 9,000 years ago. Over the centuries, this ancient land has seen many changes. Both animals and people have had to adapt. Each wave of immigrants has left its mark on the landscape. But the old ways still survive. The old ways which came down to the people of Erin through the mists of time.
The Crocodile River is explored on National Geographic On Assignment, next at 9, here on Channel 36.